The following week, the pressure began to mount. For Lola, it was a constant juggling act between her studies and the increasing weight of her feelings for David. She had never expected this to happen, never imagined that someone like David, with his wealth and his complicated family dynamics, would be someone she could grow close to. Yet, here they were, two people from entirely different worlds, navigating a connection that neither of them quite understood. David, on the other hand, seemed to be retreating further into his own mind. Despite their conversations, despite the moments of vulnerability he had shared with her, he still couldn't seem to fully let go of the facade. It was as if there was an invisible wall between them, one he built carefully and kept high, no matter how much he seemed to want to break through it. It was on a particularly difficult day, one where Lola had been struggling with an overwhelming amount of schoolwork and social pressure, that the tension between them reached a breaking point. It started with a chance encounter in the hallway. Lola was rushing to her next class, papers and books clutched in her arms, when she saw David at the far end of the corridor, talking with his usual group of friends. As she approached, she couldn't help but overhear the conversation. "Lola's cute, but she doesn't belong here," one of the girls in David's group said, her tone dismissive. "She's just a scholarship student. She's not one of us." Lola froze in her tracks, the sting of the words cutting deep into her chest. She had heard the whispers before, the judgment of her classmates, the way they saw her as an outsider. But hearing it from David's group, especially from someone he seemed to consider a friend, made it feel like a personal betrayal. She turned around quickly, trying to make it to her next class before anyone could see the hurt on her face. But as she rounded the corner, she collided with someone. She looked up, and her heart skipped a beat when she saw David standing there, his face hard to read. "Lola, wait," he started, but Lola held up a hand, shaking her head. "I don't need to hear it, David," she said, her voice sharp. "I get it. You don't have to pretend with me. I'm not like them. I never was." David's expression faltered for a second. He had heard the conversation, but Lola was already walking away before he could say anything else. The last thing he wanted was for her to think he agreed with what his friends had said, but he wasn't sure how to explain that. He had been caught in the moment, caught up in the expectations placed on him by his family and his social circle. And it wasn't until Lola turned away, her back to him, that he realized how far he had let her slip away. "Lola, please," David called after her, his voice desperate now. But Lola didn't stop. She couldn't. The anger, the hurt, the disappointment, it all boiled up inside of her. She wasn't sure why David's words hurt so much, but they did. She had never asked for his validation, never expected him to defend her. But hearing those words, hearing them from someone she had grown to care for, was different. That afternoon, she locked herself in her room, pushing her books aside as she sank onto the bed. She stared at her phone, unsure whether to call him or not. She had never been the type to dwell on things, but this time it felt different. It felt like something had shifted in their relationship, something that could never be taken back. Meanwhile, David was pacing the school grounds, his thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and guilt. He had never intended to hurt Lola, never wanted her to feel like an outsider. But the pressure from his friends, from his family, had made him act in a way he wasn't proud of. He had allowed himself to get caught up in the expectations, in the judgment, and now he was paying the price. He sent Lola a text, his hands shaking as he typed out the words. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean what they said. Please, let's talk." Lola stared at the message for a long time before she deleted it, a wave of frustration and sadness crashing over her. She had hoped that David was different, that he would stand by her, no matter what. But in that moment, it felt like she was just another girl in his world, a world that she could never truly be a part of. The days following that afternoon were tense and filled with a thick silence that neither Lola nor David knew how to break. David had sent the text, but Lola never responded. She wasn't sure if she was angry, hurt, or just disappointed. Maybe it was all of it combined. What bothered her the most was how easily she had allowed herself to fall into a space where she needed David's validation to feel valued. It wasn't just about the words his friends had said. It was about the way he had stood there, frozen, not defending her. She understood the pressures he faced, the constant battle to maintain a certain image. But she also knew that sometimes the people who matter to you deserve more than just silence in the face of injustice. For David, the days felt like a slow unraveling. He could feel the distance growing between them, the invisible walls rising higher and higher. It wasn't that he didn't care, it was the opposite, in fact. He cared so much that it terrified him. The more he tried to fix things, the more he seemed to make them worse. His world was complicated, and Lola was a complication he wasn't sure he was ready for. But that didn't change the fact that every moment without her felt emptier, like a part of him was missing. He tried to reach out again, sending Lola a message after school. "I never meant to hurt you. Can we talk?" But once again, there was no reply. He sat there, staring at his phone for what felt like an eternity, the tension of the situation weighing down on him like a storm cloud that refused to disperse. He wasn't used to feeling this helpless, and it frustrated him to no end. On the third day of his silence, David ran into Lola in the library. He had been walking through the aisles, searching for a quiet place to think, when he spotted her sitting alone at a table, her nose buried in a textbook. For a split second, he almost turned around, but something inside him urged him to stay. He walked up slowly, and Lola looked up from her book, her eyes flickering with a mix of emotions. "Lola," he started, his voice hesitant. "I know you're upset with me, and you have every right to be. But can we at least talk about it?" Lola closed her textbook, her gaze never leaving his face. She didn't speak at first, the words caught in her throat. Part of her wanted to forgive him, to move past the pain, but another part of her, one that had been hurt too many times before, was reluctant to let him off the hook so easily. "I don't know, David," she said quietly. I don't get it. You're always so careful about what you say, about what people think. But when it mattered, you didn't stand up for me. You didn't say anything when they made those comments." David winced, the guilt settling in his chest. "I know, and I hate myself for it. But you have to understand, the pressure to fit in, to live up to expectations, it's not as easy as it looks. It's not just about me. It's about my family, my future, everything." Lola's heart softened, but the bitterness still lingered. She had been raised to believe that integrity was more important than anything else. She had always been taught to stand up for what was right, even when it was hard. But David's world was different. His battles were different, and that made it harder to understand. "I get that you're under pressure, David," she said after a pause. "But I'm not just some obstacle to be navigated around. I don't want to be just another part of your social strategy. If we're going to be friends or whatever this is, it has to be real. No more pretending." David nodded, his eyes searching hers, looking for some sign that she was willing to forgive him. "I don't know how to fix this, Lola, but I'll try. I'll try to be better." Lola looked at him, her expression unreadable for a long moment. She had always believed in the power of second chances, but a part of her feared that she was making a mistake. She wasn't sure if David could ever fully change. But in that moment, she realized that maybe it wasn't about him changing for her. Maybe it was about both of them learning to navigate their worlds together, imperfections and all. "You don't have to be perfect, David," she said finally, her voice softer. "You just have to be honest. And I need you to understand that I can't be part of a world where I'm invisible or just a token." David's face softened, and he took a deep breath, as if the weight of her words was settling in. "I'll do better. I promise." For the first time in days, Lola felt a flicker of hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make her believe that maybe, just maybe, they could find their way back to each other. It wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to be perfect, but as she looked at David, she realized that maybe their connection was worth fighting for. The days following their conversation in the library were filled with a tentative calm. David had tried to make things right by being more present, more open. He had apologized for his actions and promised Lola that he would do better. But for Lola, the road to forgiveness wasn't as simple. She wanted to believe in him, but her heart couldn't forget how easily he had turned a blind eye to her feelings. Despite this, they began to find their way back to each other. They exchanged small, meaningful conversations between classes. David started to show up at the same study spots where Lola liked to read, and instead of avoiding her gaze, he would smile and greet her, just as if nothing had ever happened. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. Slowly, the coldness between them began to thaw, and for the first time in a long while, Lola allowed herself to hope again. However, the weight of their different worlds continued to linger. While David was trying to navigate the complexities of his family's expectations and the high social standing he had been born into, Lola was constantly reminded of the pressure she faced to prove herself worthy of being at the school. Every day was a balancing act for both of them, but their struggles were often invisible to the people around them, and their moments of vulnerability felt more like secrets they couldn't afford to share. Lola had learned to keep her emotions in check. She had grown up in a world where showing weakness wasn't an option, and though she had always managed to excel academically, the quiet whispers of judgment from her classmates, especially from those who had known her as the scholarship girl, made her feel like an outsider. She couldn't help but feel like she didn't belong in the same spaces as David and his friends. The disparity in their worlds was evident in every glance, in every whispered conversation behind her back. But what was even more difficult for Lola was the fact that, despite everything, she couldn't deny the growing feeling she had for David. They weren't just the butterflies of a passing crush. There was something deeper, something that made her feel both alive and afraid. She had always been careful not to let herself get swept away by emotions, but with David, it was different. Every time he smiled at her, every time they shared a quiet moment, she felt herself falling, and it terrified her. David, for his part, was struggling with his own set of expectations. He had always been the heir to a powerful tech empire, a future laid out for him by his family, a future that had been decided long before he could even form his own opinions. His father, in particular, had always placed heavy expectations on him, pushing him to be more than just a son, but a successor to a legacy that carried immense responsibility. The pressure was suffocating, and it made David retreat into his own world of isolation, a world where he could protect himself from the burden of his family's ambitions. But Lola was different. She was someone who saw beyond the wealth, beyond the title. She saw him as a person, not just as the heir to a business empire. And for the first time in years, he began to wonder if he could ever escape the shadow of his family's expectations. He didn't want to be just a puppet, strung along by the strings of his father's desires. He wanted to live for himself, make decisions that were his own, but that wasn't a luxury he could afford, especially when his future was already mapped out for him. One afternoon, after a long and stressful day at school, David found himself sitting at the edge of the school's rooftop, staring out over the city of Lagos. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden hue over the skyline, and the world below seemed so far away. It was moments like these when David felt the weight of his life the most, when he could escape from the noise and expectations and just think. Lola had spotted him from across the courtyard and hesitated for a moment before deciding to join him. She had noticed the distant look in his eyes, the same look he had worn when they first met. The look of someone who carried a heavy burden, someone who was struggling with a decision they didn't want to make. "Mind if I join you?" she asked softly, approaching him. David looked up, surprised to see her there, but he didn't object. "Sure." She sat down beside him, her presence a quiet comfort. For a long time, they both just watched the city below, the silence between them speaking volumes. It was as if they didn't need words to understand the weight they were both carrying, the pressure to fit in, to meet expectations, to be something they weren't sure they wanted to be. "Do you ever feel like you're trapped?" David asked suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Like no matter what you do, you're always going to be stuck in the same place, playing a role that was assigned to you." Lola turned to him, surprised by his vulnerability. She had always seen him as the confident, untouchable figure, but now she saw the cracks in his armor. "Every day," she replied quietly, "I sometimes wonder if I'm doing all this just to prove something to people who don't even care. But I have to keep going. I don't have a choice." David nodded, his eyes darkening with understanding. "It's the same for me," he said. "I'm always trying to live up to everyone else's expectations. don't even know who I am anymore." For the first time, Lola saw a glimpse of the person behind the mask. It was raw, it was painful, and it was something she could relate to. In that moment, they weren't just David and Lola, the rich kid and the scholarship girl. They were two people struggling with the same pressures, the same uncertainty, and maybe, just maybe, they could help each other find a way out. The more David and Lola spent time together, the clearer it became that their connection was undeniable. Yet despite their shared moments of vulnerability, a sense of uncertainty still hung in the air. The weight of their respective lives, David's familial obligations and Lola's struggle for acceptance, loomed over them like a storm waiting to break. For Lola, things weren't getting any easier at school. Every day was a reminder of the subtle prejudice she faced as a scholarship student. The whispers behind her back had gotten louder, and the judgment from her peers had become even more apparent. It wasn't just the students who came from wealthier backgrounds. Even the teachers seemed to treat her differently at times, as if she were an outsider, someone who didn't truly belong. She had tried to ignore the sneers, the murmurs, but they had started to chip away at her confidence. David, too, noticed the way people looked at Lola, and it troubled him. But his own battle, his constant struggle with the expectations placed on him, kept him from speaking out the way he wanted to. His friends were already beginning to question his growing friendship with Lola, and David could feel the pressure mounting. It all came to a head during a class project. The students were divided into teams, and, to Lola's surprise, she found herself paired with David. It should have been a relief. Working with David would have made the project easier, and they had been getting along better recently. But instead, it felt like the perfect storm was brewing. As they began to discuss their project, the tension was palpable. David seemed distracted, his mind clearly elsewhere, while Lola struggled to hide her frustration. She had already picked up on the way his friends had been eyeing them both. His sudden reticence only added to her anxiety. "David," Lola said quietly after a long silence, "is there a reason you're not really talking about the project?" David snapped his attention back to her, his face clouded with a mixture of guilt and confusion. "Sorry, I'm just thinking about some stuff. It's not about you, I promise." Lola wasn't convinced. She had seen the way his friends looked at them when they were in class together, the silent judgment they held for him as he spent time with her. It hurt, but she knew it was something they both had to deal with. What bothered her more, though, was the growing sense that David might be distancing himself from her without even realizing it. "David," she pressed, her voice tinged with frustration, "you don't have to apologize for your friends. If you're uncomfortable working with me, just say it. I can handle it." David looked at her, his eyes wide with alarm. "What? No, that's not it at all." He hesitated, and for a moment, it felt like he was struggling with something inside himself, something he wasn't ready to admit. "It's just that." "Just that what?" Lola interrupted, her patience running thin. "That you can't be seen with me? That being friends with a scholarship girl is going to hurt your reputation?" David's face hardened, and for a moment, Lola thought she might have pushed too far. But then, his expression softened, and he sighed. "It's not that simple, Lola," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't want you to think I'm ashamed of you. I'm not. It's just, my world isn't like yours. People don't understand. My family doesn't understand. They expect me to follow a certain path, and I'm constantly fighting against it. It's exhausting." Lola stared at him, her heart heavy with the weight of his words. She wanted to believe him, to accept his apology, but the reality was that nothing had really changed. His actions spoke louder than his words, and right now, his actions were speaking volumes about the distance between them. David seemed to sense her hesitation. He reached across the table and took her hand, his touch tentative but sincere. "Lola, I'm trying. I'm really trying. I don't want to hurt you." Lola looked at their joined hands for a long moment before pulling away. She wasn't sure if she could continue to give so much of herself to someone who seemed to be constantly running from the truth of their relationship. She had learned the hard way that love, no matter how real it felt, wasn't enough to overcome everything. "I know you're trying, David," she said quietly, her voice soft but resolute. "But sometimes trying isn't enough. Sometimes you have to show it. You have to fight for it. David's eyes flickered with regret. I will. I promise. I'll prove it to you. I just need more time. But Lola wasn't sure that time would make a difference. Time had already passed, and so much of it had been spent in silence, in uncertainty. She wasn't sure if she could wait any longer. The bell rang, signaling the end of class. As students began to pack their bags, Lola gathered her things, not sparing David another glance. She had made up her mind. She needed space. She needed to figure out if she was willing to risk everything for someone who might not even be able to risk a little bit of his world for her. David watched her leave, the hollow ache of his own indecision settling deeper in his chest. He had known it wasn't going to be easy, but the reality of it was harder than he could have ever imagined. He couldn't lose Lola, not when she had come to mean more to him than anyone else. But could he ever truly bridge the gap between their worlds? As the weight of that question settled over him, David knew one thing for certain. He had to act. If he didn't, he would lose her forever. The next few days at school felt like a blur for Lola. Every glance from David seemed like an unspoken apology, but every word he spoke felt like a hollow promise. She could see him trying to prove he wasn't like the others, trying to show that his feelings for her were genuine. But the more he tried, the more Lola felt the distance between them growing. She had hoped that their conversation would lead to a change, that David would begin to see things from her perspective. But instead, it felt like nothing had changed at all. The whispers continued, the glances from his friends became more obvious, and the quiet judgment from her peers was just as loud. Lola had to admit, as much as she wanted to believe in David, as much as she cared for him, the truth was that the divide between their worlds was too wide to ignore. The pressure weighed on her. She was constantly aware of her status as the scholarship girl, the outsider who didn't belong in a world of privilege. Every day, she had to work twice as hard to prove she deserved to be there, to silence the doubts in her own mind. It was exhausting, and David, despite his promises, seemed unable to shield her from the harsh reality of their circumstances. One afternoon, after a particularly grueling class, Lola found herself alone in the school courtyard, sitting on one of the stone benches. She stared down at her phone, not really seeing the screen. Her mind was far away, on her family back home, on the dreams she had for her future, and on the uncertain road that lay ahead. She hadn't realized how much time had passed until she heard a familiar voice. Lola! She looked up and saw David standing in front of her, his expression conflicted. There was something different about him, something raw, something vulnerable. David, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. What do you want? I came to apologize, he said, his voice low and sincere. For everything. For making you feel like you don't matter. For not seeing the way things were affecting you. I've been selfish. I haven't been the friend you need. Lola's heart twisted at his words. She wanted to believe him. She really did. But the truth was, no matter how much he apologized, the damage had already been done. David, she said, standing up to face him, I don't know what you want from me anymore. You keep saying things will change, but nothing ever does. And I can't keep waiting for something that might never happen. It's not fair to either of us. David's face fell. He reached out, almost instinctively, as if to grab her arm, but he stopped himself just short of touching her. Lola, please don't do this. I know I've made mistakes, but I don't want to lose you. I don't want to lose what we have. Lola shook her head, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. What we have? David, I don't even know what that is anymore. I don't know if you can ever really see me, or if you just see the idea of me. A scholarship girl who somehow managed to make it into your world. The words cut deeper than she intended, but they were true. And for the first time in a long while, Lola felt like she was standing up for herself. She wasn't just the girl trying to make it in a world where she didn't belong. She was Lola, someone who deserved to be treated with respect and dignity, no matter her background. David's eyes softened with regret. Lola, that's not how I see you. I don't see you as a scholarship girl. I see you as someone who has a strength that I admire. Someone who's willing to fight for what they believe in. You're not just a student to me. You're more than that. Lola's heart raced as his words settled in her chest. She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that there was a chance for them. But the truth was, she wasn't sure if their relationship could survive the weight of their differences. The pressure, the expectations, it was all becoming too much. "I want to believe you," she said, her voice breaking. "But I don't know if I can keep doing this. I don't know if I can keep giving everything I have, only to have it feel like it's never enough." David stood in front of her, his face pained as he struggled to find the right words. He had never been good at this, at speaking from his heart. But for Lola, he was willing to try. "I know I haven't been perfect," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "but I'm willing to fight for you. I'll prove it. I'll prove that I can be the man you need me to be. But I can't do it alone, Lola. I need you to trust me." Lola looked at him, her heart torn between the love she felt for him and the fear that it would never be enough. The fear that, no matter how hard they both tried, the world they came from would always pull them apart. "I don't know, David," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't know if I can trust you." And with that, Lola turned and walked away, leaving David standing alone in the courtyard, the weight of her words crashing down on him. As she walked through the gates of the school, her heart ached with uncertainty. She didn't know what the future held for her and David. She didn't know if they could overcome the walls that separated them. But what she did know was that she couldn't keep living in a world where she felt invisible, where she felt like she was constantly fighting for something that might never come to fruition. The unspoken truth was clear now. They were both too far apart, and despite everything, Lola didn't know if they could ever bridge the gap between their worlds. The days after the confrontation were long and filled with uncertainty. Lola threw herself into her studies, hoping to distract herself from the painful reality of her relationship with David. But no matter how hard she tried to focus, her mind kept drifting back to the raw emotions of that afternoon. The hurt in David's eyes, the way she had felt torn between her love for him and the growing sense that they were drifting further apart. At school, the atmosphere was stifling. Her classmates seemed more distant than ever, their whispers louder and more biting. It was as if her decision to distance herself from David had confirmed what they had been saying all along. She was just the scholarship girl, someone who didn't belong in their world. And that hurt more than anything. David, too, seemed to be struggling. He no longer approached her in the hallways with the same openness he once did. He avoided eye contact, his usual confidence replaced by a guarded distance. But despite this, Lola couldn't help but notice the way he still looked at her when he thought she wasn't paying attention. The longing in his eyes, the silent plea for her to return to him. But Lola was no longer sure if she could. Could she really go back to someone who had failed to understand her? Someone who hadn't been able to shield her from the harsh realities of their worlds colliding? The weight of her decision felt like a heavy burden, one she wasn't sure she was strong enough to carry. It all came to a head one afternoon after class. Lola had been walking home when she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind her. She knew who it was before she even turned around. David. "Lola, wait." His voice was urgent, but there was an underlying desperation that caught her attention. She stopped, but didn't turn around immediately. She knew what was coming. David would try to convince her to give him another chance, to trust him, to believe that he could change. But she wasn't sure if she was ready to open her heart to him again. "Please, just let me explain," David said, coming up beside her. He was out of breath, as if he had been running to catch up with her. Lola turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "Explain what, David? Explain why things haven't changed? Explain why every time I try to get close, I end up feeling more alone." David winced at her words, but he wasn't backing down. "I know I've messed up. I know I've hurt you, but I'm trying to make it right. I swear I am. I don't know how to fix this. I don't know how to be what you need." Lola felt a pang of sympathy, but she quickly pushed it aside. She couldn't let herself fall for his words again. She had given him so many chances, and each time, it felt like she was getting less in return. "I need someone who will fight for me, David. Not someone who only shows up when it's convenient for them. I can't keep doing this. I can't keep giving more of myself when I don't even know if you truly see me. Not the scholarship girl, not the outsider. Just me." David's face fell, his expression a mix of guilt and frustration. "I see you, Lola. I see you more than anyone else ever has. You're not just some project to me. You mean more to me than anyone." His words hung in the air, but Lola didn't know if she could believe them anymore. Every time he said things like that, it felt like he was trying to convince her that their love was enough to overcome everything. But it wasn't enough. It never had been. She stepped back, her heart heavy with the weight of her decision. "Maybe you don't see me, David. Maybe you only see who you want me to be. But I can't keep living in the shadow of your world. I need to stand on my own." David opened his mouth to say something, but no words came out. He was frozen, his emotions too tangled to find the right thing to say. For the first time, he realized that Lola was right. He hadn't been there for her when she needed him most. He had been too wrapped up in his own battles, too consumed by the expectations of his family and his friends. And now, he was about to lose her. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Lola shook her head, fighting the tears that threatened to fall. "I know you are, David, but sometimes sorry isn't enough." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving David standing in the middle of the street, his heart aching with the realization that he had failed her. As Lola made her way home, the weight of her decision settled over her like a thick fog. She had been torn between her feelings for David and the need to protect herself. And in the end, it seemed that the only way forward was to let him go. The journey ahead was unclear. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for sure. She couldn't keep sacrificing her own happiness for the sake of a relationship that was only ever going to be one-sided. But even as she walked away, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just closed the door on something that could have been beautiful. The days after her confrontation with David felt strangely empty for Lola. She had made her decision, painful as it was, and had walked away. But now, as she settled into the quiet solitude of her life, she couldn't shake the gnawing feeling of regret. She knew what she had done was necessary, but the silence that followed felt unbearable. Her classmates seemed to notice the change. The whispers had died down, but in their place was a stillness that hung in the air. It was as if the entire school had been holding its breath, waiting for the fallout from Lola and David's breakup. But no one said anything to her directly. Instead, they kept their distance, unsure of how to approach the girl who had once been at the center of their whispered gossip. Lola focused on her studies, diving deeper into her work than ever before. The library became her refuge, the place where she could escape from the world around her. She threw herself into the books, her mind seeking solace in the logic and structure of the words on the pages. But even in the quiet corners of the library, David's face kept appearing in her thoughts. He hadn't reached out to her since that day. No texts, no calls, just a painful silence that she hadn't expected. It hurt, but at the same time, Lola realized it was for the best. They needed space, time apart to heal from the hurt and confusion they had caused each other. But as the days turned into weeks, Lola found herself missing him in ways she hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just the romance, the stolen glances, or the moments of laughter they had shared. It was the connection they had once had, the understanding between them, the way he had made her feel seen when so many others only saw her as the scholarship girl. Yet, even as she missed him, Lola knew deep down that the space between them wasn't just physical. It was emotional and maybe even irreversible. The walls they had built between their worlds, their families, their expectations were too high to climb over. No matter how much she had wanted to believe that love could conquer all, reality had shown her a different truth. She was sitting in the library one afternoon, her mind drifting between the pages of her book and the lingering thoughts of David, when a familiar voice broke through her haze. "Lola!" She froze. It wasn't the voice she had been expecting. It wasn't David. It was Cindy. Cindy, her best friend, had been her constant throughout all the chaos, the one person who had never judged her for the choices she had made. Cindy's presence was always a source of comfort, and for the first time in days, Lola felt her heart settle. "Cindy," Lola said, managing a smile as she looked up from her book. "Hey, what's up?" Cindy sat down beside her, her expression serious. "I've been trying to reach you," she said, concern in her voice. "I haven't seen you much lately. You've been so distant." Lola sighed, closing the book in front of her. She hadn't realized how much she had pulled away from everyone, how she had buried herself in her studies to avoid the pain of the situation with David. But now, sitting in front of Cindy, she felt the weight of her isolation. "I've just been trying to figure things out," Lola admitted. "It's been a lot, Cindy. You know about David and me. I don't even know what's real anymore. I don't know what I'm doing." Cindy nodded, her gaze softening. "I get it. I really do. But Lola, you're not alone in this. You don't have to figure everything out by yourself. I'm here for you, okay? You don't have to carry this weight alone." Lola's heart tightened at her friend's words. She had always been so strong, so independent. But in that moment, she realized how much she had been carrying on her own. The loneliness she had tried to fight off had slowly consumed her. And now, Cindy's reminder that she wasn't alone felt like a lifeline. "I don't know what I'm doing, Cindy," Lola confessed, her voice shaking. "I thought I was doing the right thing. Walking away from David, I thought it was what I needed, but now, I'm not so sure. Everything feels so uncertain." Cindy reached out, placing a comforting hand on Lola's. "It's okay to feel uncertain. It's okay to not have everything figured out right now. You've been through so much, Lola. You're allowed to feel lost. But don't let that stop you from moving forward." Lola looked at her best friend, her heart swelling with gratitude. Cindy's unwavering support, her understanding, was exactly what she needed to hear. It gave her strength in the face of all the doubts and fears swirling in her mind. "I don't want to be lost forever," Lola said softly. "I just don't know where to go from here." "You'll figure it out," Cindy said, her voice full of conviction. "You're strong. You always have been. Just remember, you don't have to do it alone." Lola smiled, feeling a weight lift off her shoulders. For the first time in weeks, she felt like she could breathe again. With Cindy by her side, she knew she could face whatever came next, even if it meant facing the future without David in it. And as she sat there with her friend, Lola realized that sometimes the most important thing wasn't having all the answers. It was having the courage to keep moving forward, even when everything felt uncertain. Lola's life began to find a new rhythm. It wasn't perfect, and the weight of the past still lingered. But with Cindy by her side, she found the strength to face each day with more resolve. The tension that had once defined her every move seemed to dissolve into the steady pace of her studies and friendships. She still missed David in ways she couldn't fully explain, but the pain was no longer suffocating her. School had become more bearable, less filled with the noise of whispers. It was as if the storm had passed, and while the damage remained, it wasn't as overwhelming as before. Lola focused on her grades, knowing that the scholarship she had won was her way out of the confines of her past. She wasn't going to let the challenges of her personal life keep her from achieving the future she had dreamed of. But just as Lola started to feel a sense of peace, the unexpected happened. One afternoon, as she was walking to her next class, she saw him again. David. He was standing near the entrance of the school, his expression conflicted, partly hopeful, partly regretful. Lola's heart skipped a beat, her body instinctively freezing as their eyes locked. David took a step toward her, and for a moment, it felt like time had stood still. The world around them blurred as the memories of their time together came rushing back. But then, reality hit Lola hard. "Lola," David said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. She swallowed hard, trying to steady herself. "David, what are you doing here?" I want to talk to you. To apologize for everything I did. For the way I treated you. You were right, Lola. I didn't see you. Not truly. I was so caught up in my own world, my own battles, that I didn't recognize what I had until it was too late." Lola took a deep breath, her heart heavy with conflicting emotions. She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that the man standing before her now was the same person who had once made her feel special. But she wasn't the same girl she had been when they first met. She had changed. She had learned to rely on herself, to find strength in places she hadn't known existed. "I can't go back, David," Lola said, her voice firm but soft. "I've learned a lot about myself these past few months. And one thing I've learned is that I don't need someone else to complete me. I'm enough on my own." David's face fell, the pain of her words evident in his eyes. But Lola stood her ground. This wasn't about him or the past anymore. It was about her future, and the life she was now building for herself. "I think you're right," David said quietly. "I think you are enough, and I'm sorry for not seeing that sooner." Lola nodded, the ache in her heart softening. She wasn't angry anymore, not with David, not with herself. She had made her peace. "I hope you find what you're looking for, David," Lola said, her voice calm. "And I hope you learn to see yourself the way others see you. You deserve to be happy." As she turned to walk away, Lola couldn't help but glance back one last time. David was still standing there, watching her leave. For a moment, their worlds seemed to collide once again. But this time, she didn't look back for him. She looked forward to the future that was hers to claim. Graduation day arrived faster than Lola had anticipated. The past few months had been a whirlwind of emotions, and though she had let go of the past, it still felt surreal to think that her time at the school was coming to an end. The scholarship that had once seemed like an impossible dream had opened so many doors for her, and now, those doors were ready to lead her to the future. The ceremony was filled with speeches, cheers, and tears. Lola sat among her classmates, her heart full but steady. She was proud of how far she had come, proud of the girl she had become, the girl who had learned to stand tall, even when the world around her seemed uncertain. She had faced so much, and yet here she was at the finish line. Cindy sat beside her, beaming with pride. "I knew you could do it," Cindy whispered, squeezing Lola's hand. "You've worked so hard, and you deserve this moment." Lola smiled, her eyes glistening with tears. "I couldn't have done it without you. Thank you for always believing in me." The ceremony continued, and soon it was time for the graduates to receive their diplomas. When Lola's name was called, she walked up to the stage with a sense of accomplishment, the weight of her past lifted by the power of her journey. She had worked hard, fought for what she believed in, and had learned to trust herself. As she shook the principal's hand, she felt a quiet sense of triumph. When the ceremony ended, Lola stood outside the school, basking in the warmth of the afternoon sun. The air felt different, filled with the promise of new beginnings. She had no idea where the future would take her, but she knew one thing for sure: she was ready. David hadn't come to the graduation. She hadn't expected him to, but a small part of her had hoped he would. Still, she didn't feel the weight of disappointment. She had made peace with their past, and the future was waiting for her to step into it. As Lola stood there, looking out over the crowd of graduates, she felt the world shift beneath her feet. Her journey was just beginning, and for the first time in a long while, she was excited to see where it would take her.